Hi everyone, I'm Diana Swain at CBC News. I'm the senior investigative correspondent here. I'm also the host of the program, The Investigators with Diana Swain, that we've ever so subtly put right here. And joining me to talk about Incel today is Judith Taylor. She's professor in the Department of Sociology at U of T. She's also with the Women and Gender Studies Institute there. We're talking about Incel for reasons that may seem obvious, but if not, here's part of the background to that. So, of course, there was the attack in Toronto on Monday in which a man drove a van down Yonge Street, killing 10 people and injuring more. He has been charged with that, and in part of the investigation, it's been determined that there was a post on his Facebook site that came out just beforehand that references Incel. For most of us, that was the first time we'd heard about it. Who knows if that was his motivation or not? That's still to come. But it sort of raised this notion of what is Incel, who's talking about it, why is it a problem for some people and not for others. So ask us your questions. This is the chance to kind of say, hey, I've been wondering about this since I've been hearing about it on Monday. Maybe you've heard about it for a lot longer. Maybe you're on the site, whatever it is. We're going to try and talk this through. This is meant to be really informal. So to that end, I forgot to wear my contacts today, so I'll be wearing my groovy great big glasses because that's the only way I can read my phone, and that's where I'm going to be getting some of the questions. So, Judith, we have one already. This is from Stephen Howland. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right. He says, they all need to be arrested. Would that be a rational solution? So I'm going to say, off the bat, probably not, because belonging to a chat group is certainly not illegal.
Right, yeah. So I understand his frustration, right? And I think one of the interesting things about social media is that you can make all kinds of violent threats, and because of the nature of how people identify, there's usually kind of monikers in the email addresses. So it's like kind of different levels of anonymity that are happening there, and yet there are thousands of people who are building a culture and building a communication and building a community and making threats and egging one another on, and it's very hard to trace. So I can see why people would feel a level of desperation about that, because violent threats are not something we should feel comfortable with.
And I'm guessing I'm sort of putting us in the position of trying to figure out the legal side of this, but if someone made a violent threat against a particular person online, you've got maybe legal remedies there. If it's generic, it's about all women, I'm not sure that there's a legal remedy. And, I'm sort of stepping a bit outside the frame there, but I think that's part of the issue.
Right, it's true. The interesting thing, though, is that if you look at Canadian law enforcement at the upper echelons, they have undertaken many campaigns to investigate civil rights actors, investigate socialists, investigate peace activists, investigate feminists. There might even have been a file on me once upon a time, who knows? And so the question is, what is the focus for law enforcement? Who is the perceived threat? And how does that change over time? I don't know if law enforcement has given this community much attention, and I don't think it's about arresting everyone, but if we could see what kinds of links there are between threats and actual violence, that might actually help. Or if we can look at demographics and understand how populations are actually seeking help, that also would be a good thing for them to do.
And I should probably back up a little bit, assuming that everybody even knows what incel means. So the idea is that you are involuntarily celibate, that you've wanted to have a sexual relationship with someone and no one has been receptive to your advances. So people are in a community, I guess, online, talking about it. In some cases, it seems kind of, whipping each other up into a frenzy about it. So there's an interesting question here. Hans Olaf on YouTube says, do you think prostitution would help incels? And he says, serious question. And, fair enough. I mean, is that one route to dealing with people who feel frustrated because they haven't had a sexual experience?
Yeah, Associated Press actually asked that too. So I guess it's on many citizens' minds. I guess sex workers themselves would be really interesting to consult on this question. Yeah, I don't think that sex work is hard to access. If you look at the back of Now magazine, which is Toronto's largest daily and probably most free dailies throughout this country, you can find sex workers really easily. So I'm for legalization actually, but I don't think that's really the impediment. And I actually don't think that people who join Incel are specifically sad about not having intercourse. I think they're feeling really lonely. I think they're feeling misunderstood. I think they're feeling socially dislocated. And I think that that social dislocation couldn't really be solved by paying for sex.
So here's a question from Anna Campana. Sorry if I'm pronouncing these wrong. She says, is this a recognized mental disorder? So by this, I'm guessing that you mean the notion of feeling a need to belong to a community to talk about not having had a sexual experience?
Yeah, I don't think that involuntary celibacy is a mental disorder. I think that it can lead to depression. I think it can lead to anomie. I think it can make people feel misunderstood, and I think that can lead to feelings of sorrow, can lead to self-harm, and can sometimes lead to harm of others.
Someone says, a viewer on YouTube is asking, women incels are called volcels. Is that true? Are there women incels? It's interesting because there has been a lot of focus on men on these sites.
Yeah. I have students who are part of groups called volcels. So voluntary celibacy, meaning either I don't actually feel that sexual and I don't want that to be a central part of my social life, or right now I'm going to focus on my studies and sex isn't a big priority.
But that's
for me.
the flip, right? That's someone who's saying this is the choice I've made.
Correct.
And there are sites for men who say that's also a choice I've made. But this is, you know, it seems like incel is that idea. It's involuntary. And we have had this real focus on men this week.
Yes.
So are you aware of any sites that
well,
have women in the community?
The term involuntary celibacy actually was coined by a Canadian woman in 1993. And she wrote this very thoughtful kind of therapeutic project like, I'm involuntarily celibate. My social life didn't turn out exactly how I'd hoped. I wonder if there are other people out there too. Is it my gender identity? Is it who I am finding? What is it exactly? So this kind of beautiful opening of dialogue got taken up, this moniker got taken up by men and used in much a different way than she intended.
So it seems like, you know, like just with everything else, that there's certainly more than one incel site. It's not like there's just one that everybody goes to, and that some would have kind of a, I don't know, more reasoned discussion. Some drift way over here into misogyny and violence. Right. And it's hard to imagine that there are women on those sites who are participating in the misogyny. Who knows? But it's interesting that people are on there having this discussion. We did an interview earlier today, in fact, that we've taped for the investigators that you will see on Saturday, talking to someone who's done a lot of work on these sites as well. And he was saying how you'll see participants who are sort of asking each other to rate each other's looks and saying, like, is this why no one's attracted to me? Is it because my nose is too big? Is it because my ears are too big or my hands too small? Whatever it is.
And then they do that for them?
That they'll rate each other, and it seems like, wow, it's almost like a level of vanity in it, which surprised me because I hadn't been thinking that was part of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, the last 50 years in terms of gender relations has changed a lot, and it could be that the insecurities that women have often felt are now being democratized to men. And one of the interesting problems that men cite on these social media sites is, it used to be that you'd just get assigned a wife. But now you have to compete in this open market, and the alpha males get all the women, and the beta males are left by themselves. So they have a really deep analysis about how they've been forsaken.
A viewer on YouTube is asking, Elliot Rodger. I've heard this name lately. Who is this? And this is great because this is important context too, because on some of these sites, he's kind of like a folk hero.
Right. These sites, I mean, the dangerous part of these sites is that there does seem to be two things. One, a kind of militarized language. So he was our chief, he was the lead soldier, and then as the case in Toronto happened, this is our, what was it called? The rebellion?
Right.
Rebellion, insurrection.
The Incel rebellion.
Yes. So lots of militarized language, and then making note of men who have killed in the past because they feel lonely, like celebrating them, using their names, talking extensively about them.
So, for instance, this Elliot Rodger, who in 2014 in California killed some people in his apartment, stabbed them, in fact, then went on a bit of a shooting spree at a fraternity, killed 6 people in the end, and made this kind of video. I don't know if you call it a manifesto. I'm not really sure what you call it, but he made this video right beforehand that is widely shared now and easy to access on YouTube, in which he kind of goes on into saying, I'm so frustrated, here are all the things in my life that frustrated me, but mostly around the lack of attention from women and frustration that he was still a virgin. And this guy is celebrated in some corners.
That's right. I mean, he is a very socially alienated person who came from a very affluent family, had a tremendous amount of resources available to him, bought ammunition. And, you know, as a university professor, I have to say these campus shootings, you know, are especially frightening and hurtful to me. And I wonder, like, where are the parents when the child is buying weaponry, when the child is driving this weaponry around, making these manifestos online? Like, where are the parents in all of this? Are they completely unaware? And I have to assume they are not completely unaware. And I think this is a good wake-up call to all of us to pay attention to the kind of social media behavior that our kids are participating in. And in fact, the guys on Insel have a really fascinating self-diagnosis that we can use to judge our own children's behavior. They say, we are called NEETs: no education, no employment, no training, with no plans for education or employment. So if your child is struggling in school and the young man who is alleged to have driven the van into folks a couple of days ago was also struggling in school, was at Seneca College for quite some time.
But, you know, I would challenge that to the point that I spoke with one of his classmates who actually called him brilliant.
Right.
Said he was smart.
It's often the
killer
case.
Of their group, right?
Yeah, it's often the case.
So,
but he was there too long.
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, I know there are a lot of people who go to school for a long time because they're working. I'm not sure I'm prepared to make that leap with
I would say 8 years in community college, you got a problem going on there. I promise you. As an educator, it's my sense of, students kind of, they can meander, they can say this school isn't for me, this major isn't for me, but just kind of sticking around, especially if there's talent, there's something going on that maybe can be attended to.
Okay. Let me see, I'm just trying to go back to the beginning here. Kijiji Allen asks, why are women talking about this issue? Is this woman-splaining? Well, I mean, women are certainly affected by what happened on Monday, certainly affected by the most vitriolic conversation, the most misogynistic conversation online. So I suppose we have that connection to it. The person I interviewed earlier today, who will be on the program on the weekend, is a man. I don't know if that's more helpful to it, but I mean, is it appropriate? Should it be two men sitting here talking about incel sites? Because they do seem to be mostly men on them.
I think men, for sure have to have a big conversation about masculinity, mental health, and changes in the economy. I welcome those kinds of conversations. I facilitate those kinds of conversations. I think that the reason that two women have to have this conversation is because feminists in particular have been pinpointing the relationship between masculinity, social dislocation, and violence for like 50 years. So we know a little something about that. And also, the Southern Poverty Law Center has shown that folks who are on these sites have an interesting mix of, peculiarly, racism, sexism, and loneliness. And so anyone of color and any woman who feels afraid because of that toxic mess is going to want to talk about it.
Natasha Teresa asks, how do we use this incident? So, what happened on Monday, and again, you sort of feel like you need to caution that nobody's able to draw a direct line just yet, but it certainly started a conversation. How do we use this incident to raise the issue of safety of women? And it's, I mean, misogyny is not new to any of us. It's not a surprise, but I will say I was surprised to hear that the sites existed and that there were this kind of level of rage about not having had a sexual experience.
Right. I don't really have an answer to that question. I mean, we've been dealing with violence against women in a kind of organized way, and rape crisis and the murder of women often by their partners and dates for as long as I've been in my field and much longer. and we seem to have hit a kind of stasis. And so I think maybe the prior gentleman who said, like, why are women talking about this? Men, please talk about this. The Ontario government has started a really nice campaign on men as bystanders, men getting involved. I know men that I work with have stood up to men that they think are bullies that are affecting workplaces and making them toxic. We need to hear much more from men about how they feel about this toxicity.
Someone asked, does hypergamy, polygamy, cause incels? I don't even know what hypergamy means, so I'm just going to put that out there.
Don't know.
I guess we don't really know what causes someone to be so upset about their experience that they're reaching out in this way. And yet part of me is like, look, support groups are out there for everything you can think of, and it's not necessarily a bad thing to be able to sit down with someone or communicate with them and share something. I guess it's when it moves into this kind of a rabid sense of being betrayed, and now you've got to do something about it out there in the world, that's the problem.
There is a really important book called Modern Misogyny by a professor at the University of Houston, a psychologist, and she studies comparative entitlement. And what she showed is that when men don't get the salary that they want, when men don't get the dates that they want, they feel this sense of like outrage, whereas women just go, oh, well, I guess that's not my fortune to be had. So I guess really it's about how we assimilate loss. The disjuncture between what we hoped for ourselves and what we had. And this lovely guy who I met actually in the basement here at CBC a couple of days ago said, you know, when I was in high school, I was involuntarily celibate like most of us are in high school and also in parts of college. So
like since the beginning of time, right? There have been people who have gone, oh, I wish I was more popular with some, you know, the person of the opposite sex or the same sex or whatever they want, and just saying, hey, it's not working out. Like, this idea that it's now moved into this, that it's like, I don't know, a conversation that seems so toxic just surprises me. And I mean, I've never bought into this idea that, you know, video games beget violence. I've just sort of personally thought, I don't think so. But you hear this stuff and go, okay, is it giving people permission to whip themselves up into a really angry place they can't back away from?
I do think that it's about balance. So if you go on these sites, but you're also coaching a basketball team, but you're also volunteering at the library, but you're also, you know, like swimming, whatever, then you're seeing other people, you're out there in the world, you have some balance to those ideas. If you're sitting in a very small place like your bedroom or your basement, and that's the only real interaction that you have, that's when I think you can really lose perspective in a fundamentally bad way.
Pauline Harder asks, how does the process of radicalization compare to that of radical Islamist extremists? I would say, you know, extremists of any kind, actually, because you can find everything out there on the internet. Is it the same, that sense of somebody who maybe is feeling really vulnerable being manipulated by someone who's already on the sites? You
know, we've seen that this is gendered. I mean, young men want to be heroes. And so what do they get to be heroes of? One fascinating thing I saw was that the alleged perpetrator of a couple of days ago in Toronto tried to join the military. And so, you know, interestingly, so did this young man who shot 10 people at a community college in Oregon in 2015. So I think that they try for this kind of tight group spirit. They try for heroism in these different contexts, and if they don't succeed in them, then they're going to find other contexts in which they can succeed. And this could be in terms of radical state politics, this could be in terms of gang warfare, this could be white collar crime in the, you know, in the corporate sector. You know, it seems like men want to be part of gangs and they want to be lauded as leaders in them.
But don't women also? I mean, I think women like a sense of community. I know, but that's an individual thing, right?
Yeah, no, I'm not saying I don't. I'm saying, no, I definitively don't think that women seek the same kind of recognition as heroes that men do. And I think that could be cultural, that men are told you only matter if you save something, if you build something, if you make a lot of money, if you have a lot of markers of success.
Are we still stuck in that cultural place.
I mean,
I don't know if it's just because I've been earning my own money for a long time that I'm like, oh, I know as many women who are competitive and measure success by different markers as men, I think.
I don't think so. I mean, my undergraduates are like, maybe I'll be a stay-at-home mom or maybe I'll work. Well, I want to tell you, my male students never say that because they know that if they don't work, they don't matter. So I think things have loosened up for women in terms of what can I be and what are all the acceptable things that I might want to do. Whereas for men, they still understand that they matter in a much smaller way.
Someone asked, how do you easily identify an incel? Again, I'm not sure that I could answer that, except to say that everything we've heard this week, or that I've heard in trying to understand this better, is that most people will self-identify.
Yeah, I think we actually have to move slightly away from the incel terminology if, in fact, our goal is to actually stop this kind of violence. If we want to just stop this kind of violence, then we need to go way back and look from Columbine 1999 on. Because the same mostly white young men between the ages of 18 and 30 are committing these kinds of crimes. And so they are socially dislocated, they spend an inordinate amount of time on the computer, they're not part of clubs, they're not succeeding occupationally, and they're not succeeding educationally. So that is the thing we need to look at rather than whether someone is involuntarily celibate. The Southern Poverty Law Center has really mapped kind of a world of underground alt-right behavior that young men who have a propensity towards violence participate in. And we need to really think broadly about who is engaging in that kind of rhetoric, whether that rhetoric gets brought to your dinner table, what that person is also doing with that rhetoric, to kind of try to trace it and see if it's a call for help.
It does feel like, you know, again, that idea that someone could be really upset at their situation, frustrated, reaching out. They find something online where people are going, oh yeah, me too. You participate in that conversation, but that there's so far to get from that to acting out violently. It's hard to imagine that people in your world, whoever you are connected to, don't see some kind of change.
Right, right. I think teachers and employers and parents see what's going on.
Steve Rushford asks, would there be any way to get through to these young men that things can change for the better?
You know, maybe straight people need to take a lesson from the lesbian and gay community. They had this huge campaign called It Gets Better for young people who had a propensity towards suicide because they felt that they were going to be bullied so severely that life was never going to get better. So they brought all these people from Broadway together. They had a campaign. It had an education component. It had a music component. Like, that is one of the most bullied and rejected populations, right, who made something really powerful as a consequence. Why can't straight men do the same? I think they should do Broadway songs instead of getting guns.
Bob Lake comments, why don't you talk to actual men instead of telling us how we feel? I think this conversation's had a lot of men in it this week. Happen to know men in my life. I'm sure there are men in your life. I mean, I don't think this is a conversation happening just between women just because you happen to see two here.
I was just on a panel. I was just on a panel with only men and me on this very topic.
I'd be curious, though, Bob, if you're still there. I mean, what would you add to this conversation that you're not hearing? What do you think that we're missing? Because I'm curious about that. Hypergamy, I mentioned earlier. I wasn't sure what that is. I guess it's the idea of sort of marrying up or marrying beyond a station, something like that. Again, if I'm misinterpreting that, let me know.
Oh, like that people are, okay, I get it, that men are, older men are taking all the young women from the young men, and then polygamists have multiple women by the same man. I don't think statistically, I mean, I'm just running through Stats Canada in my head, that is not an appreciable amount of people that would account for these men's loneliness.
Someone asked, or comments, they say that they believe feminism caused the incel phenomenon, and just you know, asking, what do you think about that?
Right, right. I mean, so yes, I'll say yes, that's true, and here's why. It turns out if you tell people that they have the freedom to fall in love with or engage with physically whomever they want, and they don't have to fall in love with or engage physically with anyone they don't want, then they're going to do that. And that means that we don't have arranged marriages, and that means that people can't be assigned to be marital partners or assigned to be sexual partners. And so, yes, in a way, Feminism has opened up the social possibilities and means that we have to use our character, our personalities to make intimacy unions. That is true.
I'm curious, I mean, is there, you have a field that sort of probably exposed you to this conversation a lot more than it's exposed me. My learning started on Monday. What is the thing that we're all not thinking of, talking about, asking about? What are we missing?
I mean, I think I said it before, but I really am concerned. I mean, I'm thinking about this man's comment here about, like, why are you women talking about men? And I will say one thing that I find really important. I have loved so many white men. I'm just going to say that right to you, audience. I have loved them. But there is a statistical problem that involves white men right now that I'm paying attention to, which does not mean that I hate them, which does not mean that I think they're evil, which does not mean that I'm ganging up on them, which does not mean that I think that they're not allowed to speak and they can't have good jobs. I sure hope they can, because I have children up, who are growing up that I intend to make support me in my old age. So, I think that there's a way in which white men have seen themselves as the center that can talk about everyone else, but no one can talk about them. And as a sociologist, I'll just say, if the data shows me that this is the population that's using guns in public places to express their unhappiness, then I have to name that.
Marcelo Dorado says, most incels are not white or alt-right. Please stop spreading misinformation. So where is it coming from, that notion that they are white or even alt-right?
Yeah, so the Southern Poverty Law Center has done research, so has the Washington Post, and so has the New Yorker. The majority of participants on 4chan and on Reddit are white men.
And how do we know that? I mean, because you can, fake a profile.
It's a really good question. It's a really good question. So we'd have to consult those sources. I think they've done their due diligence. I think that we're going to see a lot more cooperation from Reddit and 4chan in the coming months, given this kind of underground culture.
So as Marcelo is saying, most incels are not white or alt-right. We've also got lots of people saying that incels have a relationship to the alt-right. I mean, is it, again, it's that sort of, broad brush that I think is part of the problem, everybody speaking kind of absolute terms. But is there a connection in some of the sites or the most extreme sites to the alt-right, or is that just people kind of making a hop because they see the same name on this site as at that site?
Well, I mean, today I looked at it to see what was happening this morning. Some people have a moniker for Mike Pence. Other people say, like, man of Trump. So I do see an actual affiliation with mainstream politics in the United States. It's also interesting to me that, for example, if we look at the case of the young man who shot in the mosque 6 people in Quebec City, he was looking at, first he felt so socially dislocated, also bullied. He went to a shopping mall with guns, and then he thought, oh, maybe I should focus on a feminist organization at a local university. Oh, maybe I should focus on a mosque. He ended up focusing on a mosque, but there you see the kind of alt-right ideology. And one of the things that he said was he was so angry that Justin Trudeau had an ideology of welcoming immigrants, and he was so emboldened by Trump's building a wall against immigrants that he decided to act out in a heroic way, he believed, to spare Canada from immigration.
He thought he was taking action to stop a coming action, or at least that's what he's said in his defense.
So it's very important to trace people and take them at their word, right? Those are the ideologies that he was using. Those are the people that he was mentioning.
Just making sure I'm trying to get to everybody here. Tanya Scribbins says, I have known and watched a few men turn dangerously bitter after failures chasing, quote, bombshells or perfect tens, and completely ignoring regular women. Is there perhaps a link to media molded expectations?
Yeah, that's something that folks who do research on Facebook have found, that if you watch Instagram and you watch Facebook and you see people at parties and you see people with, like, beautiful women hanging on their shoulders, that you feel a sense of deprivation. prior to social media, we didn't see people having fun in abstract places all the time, right? We could only see what was available to us. And most people in our high schools or universities were basically in the same position that we were.
And we saw people as they actually
right.
look, not after they've been through 17 filters on their phone.
So yeah, there is the question, does the ubiquity of pornography make people believe that everyone is having this amazing and constant sex except for them? And the same with Instagram and Facebook. I would argue probably the people who study these kinds of networking sites show that it actually makes people feel like they're missing out.
It's interesting is that I know there are people who say, okay, if these sites are really talking about violent language, because I'm not sure anybody's really concerned about sites where people are just having a conversation about their sexuality or a frustration about not having sex, because you're like, that's kind of benign out there in the real world now. It's the violent stuff that I think people are really worried about, and I'm a little surprised. I mean, I realize people have written about it. I realize people are on the sites, they're aware of it, and that, you know, I'm not necessarily the marker for, or the bellwether for what people know about. But if this has been going on for a long time, I feel like there's a whole bunch of us who had no idea.
That's right. I mean, I find out about these organizations mostly from my students, to be honest, because they're much more connected. I don't even tweet. I don't like that kind of world. So I think that, you know, there's
we're
a lot
on that world right now, right?
Well, yeah, it's not for me interpersonally, but I think that you know, there's a new generation of people who are much more plugged in, and that's going to shape culture for sure.
I'm curious. I mean, we may be able to say, and I guess if there's some research that most of the guys on these sites are young. Why is that? You know, I mean, I'm sure there are lots of people who are older, their 30s, 40s, 50s, haven't had a sexual experience or one that met their expectations. Why aren't they on there?
Right, right. I mean, that's a really interesting question. It could just be that it wasn't available to them when they were coming up and developing their own kind of psyches and understandings of the world. So they accepted their misfortune in a different kind of way. Or actually, because they didn't have social media, just left the house and did a, you know, like went to a bar, went to a pickup game. I think we need the Elks again. I will say that. We need the Elks for these young men. They need to go to a club every Monday night and say, like, I hate my boss. How are you? And like have these conversations about masculinity, have these relationships, actually look out for one another.
So, I mean, but there are lots of people who just don't have a big individual network of friends. You know, I mean, we're a more transient society than we've ever been. Virtually everyone I work with, nobody's actually from here. You know, it's not like you have all of your high school friends nearby. Everybody's moved around. You start meeting new people, and I would say it gets harder to meet people, even just friends, as you get older. So how do people make sure that they have some kind of, I don't know, someone is sitting in front of them to talk to? Mm-hmm. I mean, isn't this the outlet that social media or online actually has filled that void for people who otherwise don't have anybody to talk to? At least
well, I think that, you know, one interesting thing that people at the United Way have been trying to tell us for years is if you feel badly about yourself, volunteer. Be part of the solution for other people who you think have it worse than you do. You'll meet people in the hospital, you'll meet people in the food bank, you'll meet people who maybe can commiserate with you, or you might feel good about yourself because you've helped someone who has more misfortune than you do.
All right, we are getting really close to sort of calling this conversation done. I've tried to make sure that I'm getting to everybody, so pardon the pause here as I just try to scroll back and make sure that the all too small font on my phone isn't causing me to miss anything. I think I've gotten to most of them. And what we've done in some cases where a lot of people have asked virtually the same question, we're just trying to kind of ask it once and move through so we can get to everybody. There are lots of incels in the comments on YouTube who are, I think, probably saying, hey, I'm not interested in being lumped in with somebody who's...
That's really important.
Who may or may not have, you know, done something violent. I mean, I think the one thing we know for sure is that Elliot Rodger said, hey, this is my motivation for this. You know, forget everything that's happened in the last 7 days. That we know.
Every conversation that we have about this, I think we have to say, if you are lonely and if you feel rejected, you mostly are a very good human being still, and you have not, you know, you do not participate in violence. I think that's, we just have to mention that. And also, there's been a very bad conflation of mental illness, Asperger's or a spectrum down, and also culture. And I think we need to be very careful to take those apart. Folks who are on the spectrum or have Asperger's don't have a greater propensity towards violence, but they can feel more rejected. And that's something that we have to take very seriously. But I think it's very important to say most lonely people do not murder. Incel might be, as it was in its derivation in 1993, a useful way to talk about loneliness, which we're experiencing more and more in society as people age and live longer and longer. So that is an important conversation to have, and we have to be really careful in how we talk about mental illness. Most people who are experiencing extreme depression also don't murder.
Okay, so someone is asking about Alec Minassian's Facebook post. So let me sort of back up for people who aren't too sure about this. So on Monday, after the incident on Yonge Street happened, a couple of the newsrooms, ours included, and I was working on that part of the story on Monday, saw a screen grab of what appeared to be a post from his Facebook. Now what's interesting is it doesn't say in there anywhere, you know, I'm about to drive down Yonge Street or anything like that, but it talks about this Elliot Rodger and the rebellion and this kind of stuff, and Chad's and Stacy's, the people that, you know, are thought to be the ones who are getting everything.
Popular. Mm-hmm.
And the question was right away, okay, I mean, we get stuff sent all the time, is it fake? And, you know, as someone mocked this up right away to try to either see if the media will bite and publish something that's false. People do this stuff all the time. You know, if there's a big incident, someone will call into a live TV show and say, oh, I was there, and they weren't. Who knows what motivates people to do it, but they do. So part of it was, okay, how does anyone know this is real? And we actually, again, I'll flip back to the investigators, because we did a conversation that we've taped for the show about how we were looking and trying to figure it out, the timestamp and stuff like that. What did it tell us? All of that fast forward to say Facebook says, yes, this came from his site, which has been shut down. I'm being a bit particular because who knows if he posted it. One assumes he posted to his own site, he didn't share his password, but enough to say it came from his site, it's been shut down. The police say that the post was sent out right before the van went down Yonge Street, and this is an avenue of investigation for them. So the veracity, I guess, the legitimacy of this post is that it came from his site. It was published right before the incident happened. Police are looking at it. Beyond that, I don't think there's a whole lot more that people can say with any certainty. Let me just go back here a second ago. Is mockery of their beliefs, I think we're talking about their being incels, an effective way of highlighting flaws in the ideology of incels?
No. I think mockery just makes people defensive, angry, and would increase their propensity for violence. I also just want to say, I can't really mock something that's so serious. I mean, I got my PhD from UC Santa Barbara, where Elliot Rodger committed that atrocity in 2014.
Were you in California at the time?
No, but in 2001, when I was a doctoral candidate, another young man, David Adius, drove his sports car into a densely populated student neighborhood called Isla Vista, killing many of them. And the next day I had a large lecture, and I said, did anyone know David Adius? Well, one student said, yeah, he was always kind of swinging a baseball bat in the hallway of the dorm. Other people said, yeah, he was always making kind of violent jokes, and people thought he was really peculiar. No one ever said anything about him to the dorm regulators, to the university administrators, to faculty members, to their parents. So I think that for me, that was a real wake-up call, and I knew students who died in that. There was a young, beautiful man who was killed in the 2014 event from my parents' neighborhood in Los Osos, California. So these killings are very, very serious to me. So I would never use mockery as a way of calling attention to them.
Someone says, why not ask, why are so many young men incel now? I guess the question is, it's
we
hard
don't
to
know that they are.
More, right? Or that they're more, because there may not have been a way for them to sort of, express that or, talk about it before. So it's hard to know, I guess, what the comparison is.
It's really sexual expectations. Like if you talk to your grandparents about how many sexual partners they had, it'll be a lot fewer than what you imagine you're going to have in the course of your lifetime. So it could be that expectations have really changed.
Okay, I think we're almost through. Again, I'm just asking for everyone's patience as I try to make sure I'm catching to all of these. And I think we're good. Listen, I'm going to thank you, first of all,
absolutely.
for joining us.
Nice to talk to you.
Coming into this darkened
Thank you for all the
space that we use
questions.
as a studio. And yeah, thank you for your questions, because if you're like me, maybe you know a lot more about the sites, maybe you've been on it, maybe you're feeling frustrated that it's getting so much negative attention, maybe you think it deserves it, I don't know, but I think that the very best all of us can do is at least talk about it and get better informed. Overall, I think we all make better decisions when we have some information to work with. So hope we've given you some. If there are questions that still come in, we'll try to get to those just on Facebook, but in terms of the Facebook Live, this is it for us. I'm Diana Swain. Judith Taylor, thank you very much, and thank you too.